Thanks, guys. Very, very excited to be here and share some fun Azure shenanigans that me and my team have been messing about with. As you can see, I was too cheap for generative AI, but yeah, let's jump into things. So just a brief note about who I am. I graduated from physics, kind of transitioned over into kind of traditional software engineering and data engineering, and for the last couple of years I've been in cybersec and loving it, and a bit of a graph nerd. So there's going to be lots of graph diagrams in this presentation. So if anyone ever wants to come up to me afterwards and chat linear algebra, I'm super down at any point. Cool. All right. So we're going to kick things off with a mystery. I'm going to introduce this topic to you in the same way that it got introduced to me, which was, how did a guest make a subscription? So I have the good fortune of working with quite a lot of different partners, and one day this came across my desk, which was one of our partners reaching out and saying, hey, how did this guest make this subscription in Azure? Upon closer inspection, when we were looking at it, it seemed like this guest account had been leaked to the dark web. Their credentials, we confirmed they were a guest B2B user, but then when we went looking for kind of what kind of permissions or privileges they had no group memberships, they didn't have any directory roles assigned, no RBAC roles assigned, and no permissions granted that we could see in any way. And yet somehow here they were sitting as the owner of a subscription. We're going to go over directory roles, RBAC roles, and all that stuff, so if some of that's a bit unfamiliar to you, don't worry. We're going to cover the Azure basics, then we're going to get into the weeds a little bit of how guest federation works. Then we're going to get into what was undocumented behavior, now thankfully is newly documented behavior, Microsoft's position on all of this, and then we're going to get into how we can potentially abuse this feature. And then finally, just to conclude, some defense. So probably some of the defenders are going to be a little bit scared towards the end, so hopefully I can reassure some of you. Okay, cool. So in terms of the Azure basics, let's start off with Entra ID. So this is on the homepage of the Entra ID website. This is kind of how Microsoft wants you to think about Entra ID at a high level. So it's really like their identity provider in Azure. You can see you can kind of attach up human identities, be that your own users or external users. These external identities is what I'm going to be referring to as B2B guests. Then you've got workload identities, and you can see we can kind of give those access to applications, and then we can kind of also integrate Entra ID with kind of our pre-existing on-prem Active Directory, and then you sort of see devices sitting off to the side, and we're going to get into that after. So first of all, let's look at the security principles in Azure. So we've got humans, those can be users and guests. Then we've got service principals, and then we have these devices, and all of these can authenticate against the directory, and then they're going to be authorized in some way. We're really going to focus on users and service principals next, because devices are a little bit strange, and there's a whole section for those later on. So in terms of users and guests, those can be assigned RBAC roles, directory roles, or app roles over specific APIs. And then service principals is pretty much the same thing, except we don't call them app roles, we call them API permissions. Underneath the hood, it's kind of very, very similar stuff going on. So next we need to start understanding Azure resources. So Azure resources is all of the infrastructure that you're going to deploy in Azure. So be that VMs, databases, networks, all that kind of stuff. They're we can group that together into resource groups. That's really just an organizational tool. But then all of those different resource groups are going to be sitting in subscriptions. Subscriptions are the logical container for all of our resources, and they are meant to act as a security boundary. And on top of that, you can see that actually we have this weird thing called management groups sitting on top of subscriptions. These can be nested, but at the very, very top, there's always going to be one root management group. And I want you to kind of put a pin in that in your mind, because that's going to be important a little bit later. But that's actually what makes the link to the directory. So that's how kind of Azure resources then kind of join into Entra ID. So in terms of the kind of typical kind of RBAC roles that we can have, These are some kind of like very typical kind of out-the-box ones. We can also make up our own custom roles. And hopefully for lots of you, all of this should be kind of like fairly familiar stuff. So let's start getting into the weeds a little bit more. So in terms of B2B guests, one quick question I had was like, why would you use a guest, right? Like, why wouldn't you just have them as a normal user and then stick them in some kind of specific group? And really the answer to that is cost-saving measures. Like, we have to then pay for that user. And so what we can do is say, like, okay, if there's users coming from other directories, we're just going to invite them into our directory. The other directory is going to pay for them as a user, and then we're just going to authorize them to do certain things in our directory. And so well, when I'm talking about the kind of defenders tenant, that's like the resource tenant in kind of B2B guest lingo, and the home tenant is where the guest is like coming from. And how it works is that like the guest doesn't actually authenticate to your directory, they authenticate to their home directory. That's going to give them an ID token, which they can then use to federate into your directory. And because you don't control the authentication, guests are sort of meant to be like extra lockdown users. So they have like even less out-the-box privileges than a normal like user. So you can see like his guest that we've like invited in. You see the invitation status in the bottom right has been like accepted. And importantly, you see the identities like field. That means that this is coming from a Microsoft account, like live account. That can also be external Azure AD. So that would depend if whether you're coming from a Microsoft account or another directory. So now let's get into a very much less well understood feature, which is billing agreements. So billing agreements can come in different flavors. The two main ones that are kind of out there for kind of typical use cases are enterprise agreements and Microsoft customer agreements. The enterprise agreements is legacy. The Microsoft customer agreement is like the newer replacement. It's kind of hard these days to get your hands on an enterprise agreement. Functionally, they work pretty similarly. Like at the very at the very top of the hierarchy, we have kind of like the contracts that you have with Microsoft. For enterprise agreements, those can kind of like optionally be then like you kind of have this idea of departments. Those are just kind of like a way to organize all your different billing stuff. Then you can have your actual kind of like billing account, and that's where you're going to add in funds, and then subscriptions like then sit inside of that. And so any usage of your Azure resources are going to be charged to that account. And then Microsoft customer agreements are like pretty similar, except that the billing profile is where you actually attach your credit card, and then the invoice section is like the organizational like aspect where you can just kind of divide up how the invoices kind of get organized, and then inside of those live subscriptions. The reason why it's interesting to us is because you can have billing roles, and with the right billing role, you would then have rights to create subscriptions. So this is what it looks like for Microsoft customer agreements. And all you need is either owner or contributor at any of these levels, and then you will get the ability to make subscriptions. There's also a specific subscription creator billing role. For enterprise agreements, it's like really pretty similar, except it's like administrator at any of these levels, and then we can create a subscription. I believe the administrator of the department isn't like a direct privilege, but that you can use it to then get privileges at the account level. So functionally, an administrator at any of these levels will get you the ability to make subscriptions. So this is then how these three worlds start like joining together. So we have, at the very top, we have our tenant, our directory. You can see that links into the Azure resources via the root management group. Then you have your subscription sitting inside of that. But then we also have this kind of weird sidecar of our billing accounts that can make subscriptions and insert those into that hierarchy. Now, this used to be an undocumented feature. The documentation is getting a lot better, but the thing that me and my team discovered is that billing roles are pretty weird. So they work across tenant boundaries. So I've deliberately drawn this diagram like this in the sense of, you'll notice it's not that we've that we're making a subscription after we've like been authorized as a guest, back in our home tenant, we get the ability to choose what directory we're going to make this subscription in. And we can just choose one of the directories that we are a guest in. And so if we look in the portal, it looks like this. You see under the advanced, we can then just go choose a different directory. And then after we do this, this is the end result. So then when we do federate into the resource directory, then we're going to get the owner RBAC role of this newly made subscription. And so then this is what that then ends up looking like in the resource tenant. So to recap, if the attacker is assigned a billing role, a sufficient billing role in their home tenant, and then invited into your resource tenant as a B2B guest, the attacker can, by default, can create subscriptions in the resource tenant. So basically, any B2B guest federating into your account is a possible vector. I found this surprising, but like I'm not a defender on the front lines. I went and spoke to all the defenders that I know. None of them expected this behavior. So naturally we went to Microsoft to get their opinion on this. They confirmed that this behavior was intended as a feature. When we met with them at the time, they said there was no controls that existed to prevent this from happening, and that it was okay because subscriptions are a security boundary in Azure. They did later reach out and say that there is actually controls, unsure whether those were added afterwards or that somehow they didn't miss that in the first meeting, but some good news, and we'll cover that later. So the kind of question from all this then arises, can guest-made subscriptions be abused? So we have some problems to fix. The first thing is that we need a reliable attack vector, right? Like, okay, we've got this cool idea that if you're a billing admin in your home tenant and then you're invited into the resource tenant, like you can maybe start to abuse this, but that's not like very great for like a reliable attack. So we need like a reliable way to get one of these billing admins into resource tenants. So kind of step one, let's become a billing admin. So let's just sign up for an Azure free trial. So once you do this, you like add in your credit card. Now you're going to be like global admin of your own new directory, and you're also going to be the person holding the credit card, which means you're like the billing owner too. So how do we get that billing admin then into the directory that we're trying to attack? Well, we can rely on default behavior, which is that guests and users by default can invite other guests into the directory. So all we now need to do is just invite this newly made billing admin into the directory, and now we have like a restless guest into the directory. So this is all cool. So we've got our subscription, but like we end up in this world where we're the owner of a subscription, but it's empty. Like all of the interesting like targets and like things that we care about attacking are sitting over in other subscriptions, and our one is empty. So this was kind of like what I then started wrestling with for a good while, trying to kind of figure out ways that we can abuse this. So I think it's worth kind of spending a little bit of moment to go over some ways that this doesn't work. So you can't just kind of take your kind of subscription ownership and go kind of try and attack another subscription. You can request a transfer of a subscription, but that's like requires like a global admin or the subscription owner on the other side to like actually like approve this, and I don't think that's like likely to work. The other thing that people have natural questions about is like what happens with the billing of all of this, and you can't use this to offload costs because this is the point of the feature. The point of the feature from Microsoft's perspective is that like you as a billing owner can be separate from the directory that the subscription lives in, and like you're going to be charged for the resources that are used, while the directory is where the subscription is going to live in. So it was this edge case that this feature was like built for. So one thing that took me an embarrassingly long amount of time to do was just to click on the I am of the subscription, and then this popped up. Which was really interesting because I thought that I was the only user who had any kind of RBAC role, right? I knew I was like a guest, but then suddenly, who are all these people? And as you can see on the scope, like it's only the guest at the top who has the scope on the resource, this is where that pin I told you to put in your minds for the root management group, this is where this comes in, which is like in normal setups, people put RBAC roles at the root management group level for all kinds of reasons. Like for global admins, they aren't actually by default have any privileges over the subscriptions, but they do have a toggle where you can say, hey, I want access to all the subscriptions in this directory, and then that's going to add them as a user access administrator to the root management group. If you then have any cross-tenant things set up in your directory, you can see here there's actually like some connectors, some key vault readers that have been synchronized to any subscription that gets made by default. So just by the act of making this, a whole bunch of these principals end up having RBAC roles because they have RBAC roles at the root management group level. The interesting thing is like if you can see at the very, very bottom, like I just try and list out the users and I get told that I have insufficient privileges to complete this operation. So this kind of made me wonder, how is this actually like working underneath the hood? And so how it works is actually like 2 API calls that it makes. Like the first is to the management API. This is the API, like the new API that's responsible for like all like the Azure resource management. And you can see what that spits you back out is like a principal ID and a principal type. And then using the principal ID, it then calls the graph API, and those IDs are looked up and then provide you like extra details about the principals. So you can see here we're like getting the display name, their email address, their user principal name, all from that lookup. And so, as I kind of explained a little bit before, this is like why this works, is because we're the owner of the subscription, we can list out the role assignments on that, and the other users have been assigned, like typically admin, over the root management group. The interesting thing is there's only a partial defense to this attack. So even on the most restrictive setting, that only stops the second lookup API call from working. So you're always going to be able to reliably get a principal ID because you always have privileges as subscription owner to look up the role assignments on your subscription. Even if you set this to the most restrictive setting, it's not going to be a complete defense. The way that this setting I think is meant to work, even though that the descriptions are a little bit confusing because it says kind of the guest user accesses restricted properties and memberships of their own directory objects. How kind of Microsoft implements that is they kind of assume that only people who know the UUID are going to be able to that is a secret in and of itself essentially, and that makes you somehow, they say, like owning the directory objects. I find that a little bit strange, but it's really just this idea of if you have it on the more relaxed setting above, then you've got to know that UUID to look it up, and then you're allowed to do it, which we were able to. Cool. So I now need to kind of have a little bit of a quick side tour into devices. I promised to get into them. Devices are a little bit strange security principles in Entra ID. So they can authenticate to the directory, but they can't get like an access token in the same way that like a user or a service principal can. Their key importance from a kind of normal practical day-to-day defense point of view is that there are key signal and conditional access policies. So if like I'm a user on a trusted device that's like managed, say, by like Intune, I'm going to get more access than if I'm just like on some random computer that doesn't have like an identity at all. The way that a device gets an identity is it joins the directory. And the interesting thing about joined devices is that they're going to be issued primary refresh tokens if a user logs into them. So primary refresh tokens, for those who aren't familiar, is like a very common like attack objective, just because PRTs are like the highest up in terms of the hierarchy of access of tokens in Microsoft's OAuth 2 implementation. So we can use those to mint refresh tokens and access tokens. They live for like up to 90 days, and yeah, we get like they're used for like SSO to like all OAuth resources in Azure. So all the different APIs that exist. There's a really great article by Dr. Azure AD who goes over the basics of like device identities, well worth reading. So how do we get one as an attacker? We're kind of like faced with like potentially a couple of problems. One, there is this like control policy that we can see. Now by default, it's set to all. That surprised me a little bit. But this control policy doesn't apply to guests. By default, guests aren't, even if this is set to all, like guests are not allowed to join devices into the directory. But we can leverage a little fun thing called Azure AD-based Windows login. And what that allows is for users to log into the VM using their Entra ID credentials. And the way that that works is that we give like a virtual machine user login RBAC role to that Azure resource, like to that VM. And then that user, then when they go to like RDP into the VM, they can then RDP using their Entra ID credentials. So it's a handy feature, but we don't actually necessarily need this to get a device. The fun thing is that we can just go change a few, like add a managed identity to the VM, update a few registry settings, and then call this dsreg command, we can do that extension process like manually ourselves. And what that ends up with is a like joined device identity here. So you can see the device state is joined. We're the guest who made this. And this really is a backdoor. It's like even if the VM gets deleted, we have this device identity will hang around. They're not tied to the life cycle of the Azure resource. So the reason why this is important, why these backdoors are useful, is because we can use these for phishing. So the key thing to understand is, as a subscription owner, we can make VMs that, as we said, are joined to the directory, but that have no trusted platform module protections. That's what typically are going to keep PRTs and device identity certificates like safe. And that we also then, because we're the person who made this virtual machine, we get local admin creds. And this is everything that we need to steal device certificates and primary refresh tokens off of the device. There's another really good article, part of that article I said before from Dr. Azure AD. He goes into this device code, device identity certificate stealing. Really good article, taught me like a lot, and massive shout out to him for pioneering this technique. So how we can start joining all of these different ideas up in our world is through this attack path. So this is now going to leverage one other important piece of research that exists, which is a technique from Durkheim, where actually there's a special kind of refresh token, which can be upgraded so long as we have like a device identity. People are using this in the wild at the moment. Microsoft like recently put out a blog saying how this was like an issue and that they were observing this by quite a few hacking groups out there. So this is very much a vector that you need to worry about. And the nice thing is that we've just made this a lot more poisonous, because we can always get our hands on a device identity certificate, which then means that we just need to go phish an admin. We've already enumerated the admins. We potentially know their email address, like their names and things like that. And so if we can get them to do a device code phish, for those who aren't familiar with device code phishing, you're interacting with legitimate URLs. The device code authentication flow is a legitimate part of the OAuth 2 implementation. The idea is that what we do is that we start off an authentication flow on one device that's going to be completed by another device. So this is like particularly helpful in like CLI environments where we don't have access to a browser, and so when we need to go do like MFA authentication and stuff, we can then go load in the URL, enter in this code, and then we completely authorize like authentication on a different device, but the original device will be sent the refresh token. There are phishing kits for this. This is how to do it with just like RoadTX, but there are sophisticated phishing kits on GitHub where they'll autofill the the code that you've got to fill in. People fall for this like all the time. And then once we get this refresh token, we can then just combine it with our device identity certificate that we got in the previous step, and now we have a full-blown primary refresh token. So if we were lucky enough that one of the users that we had enumerated from the root management group was a global admin, now we have a global admin's like PRT, and we can then go use that to log into any service that we like in Azure land. So there's another way that we can also do this too, which is called pretty similar idea, except that instead of phishing the user via a device code phish, we could also just see if we could trick them to logging into the virtual machine. We just, as the subscription owner, give one of the principal IDs that we enumerated off a virtual machine user login to this machine. We then see if we can trick them into logging into the machine. The fact that we can name these resources what we like. I was playing around with like corp, prod, bastion. You could maybe even make it look like it's like some special M&A, VM that's kind of just been kind of got some extra security protections, and that only some admins have got RDP access. I think if you could make a defender think twice before deleting it, that I'll just log in to check that like there's nothing on there. Then as soon as they log in using their Entra ID credentials, then a PRT will be issued to the device, and then we can go harvest it off of that device. So it's pretty similar. So how we can grant login, there's like there's another way that we can, there's two kind of ways that we can do it, the kind of old-fashioned way, which is a little bit of a pain, but there's actually a newer way, which is kind of the more secure way, which I actually found a very convenient way to allow for us to just send our victim, hey, like if you want to just like log in using the Bastion CLI tool, then it starts off a whole RDP session and they get prompted for their Entra ID credentials. So this is a nice way to do it. Now, something I haven't really talked about before is like the kind of elephant in the room with all of this, which is like, this is a cool attack, but if anybody goes and looks at like our Azure resources and like those assignments, like we have a guest who's like the owner of things, and that's kind of like suspicious. Like, you wouldn't really expect like guests to be owners. And Microsoft Defender for Cloud also doesn't think so. So an alert does pop up for this. The ironic thing is as the guest who is the owner in this scenario, I can just go silence this and put a waiver saying that I'm accepting this risk, that I myself am the subscription owner here, which is kind of good fun. So this works, but can we do a bit better? The trouble with just relying on that for evasion is obviously like defenders aren't just using like Defender for Cloud as like a way to kind of protect themselves. So like ideally we want to persist as a different like security principle. We want to still like retain like owner rights to the subscription, and ideally if possible we would just like disappear as a guest altogether. And the solution presents itself with like managed identities. So what are managed identities? Managed identities are a way that we can give Azure resources an identity. So underneath the hood, the way that works is that after we say create a managed identity, we can like attach it to a VM. That managed identity is going to be represented as a service principal because, as we went through before, that's like one of the fundamental security principles in Entra ID. And then that service principal can then authenticate to the directory, and it can get like access tokens. We can take this a bit further with, again, the goat himself, Dirk Jan's technique of adding federated credentials. So there is a very nice tool called like Road OIDC where we can actually spin up a little attacker-controlled OIDC provider, and then we can add that as the federated credentials. So we don't need to like worry about having some like Okta or other thing that speaks OIDC. We can just like spin up our own like lightweight thing, and now we can authenticate as a service principal. By like using our own like attacker-controlled OIDC. So we've essentially just like made ourselves a nice little like backdoor here. there's a few cool properties about this. While we haven't gained any privileges, we can assign that service principal like owner, like RBAC owner role of the subscription, so we don't lose any of those like that cool subscription owner privileges that we had before. Also, service principals aren't subject to like MFA protections, so we don't have to like worry about that so much anymore. And there's also like other mechanisms that are built into Azure to try and stop privilege escalation of users, like changing password of a user that's more privileged than ourselves. None of these like apply to like service principals. There's just like you either have the API permission to do things or like a directory role permission to do things or not. And so we're really just like one illicit API permission consent away from this being like really quite like poisonous. And there's been some really great talks here at DEF CON about some of the app API permissions that can lead to global admin. We don't have any of them, but like we are only one permission being kind of granted to kind of get to that. Now, I was really happy before I put down Restless guests forever, I wanted to just kind of put one little cherry on top, which is that we can just completely disappear as a final little evasion technique. Yeah, we are by default, and it's actually recommended and encouraged, is that we can remove ourselves from the directory. So all of those alerts that were tied to a guest owner now are going to completely disappear. I tried this out, and like sure enough, like there's not like a user disabled. Like if I go as an administrator of the directory, go try and look for that guest that existed before, like they are gone. So we've just like inserted in our persistence. We've like still got all of our poison there, but like they're not going to be able to track that back to the original like guest user. And like we just do this like here in a special like portal. So a very fun DEF CON exclusive that I have for you guys, which I'm really excited to share for any red teamers out there, is that I have now just put on my GitHub a offensive toolkit to help you do a bunch of these attacks. So if you're interested in playing around, it's really cool way to just like understand the API calls that are being made. And if you're also, I've tried to put in some interesting little optimizations like for those who know, like Foki client swapping, so that like we can kind of maximize like the use of any like refresh token that we steal. Yeah, if this is something that you want to use or try using and have any feedback, and would super love to hear how it goes on any like legitimate red team engagements. So have fun and reach out to me anytime. So just some quick demos of this working. I'm not going to show all the different tools, but you can see here, this is the commands to like create a subscription. It goes off and makes a little call to managementazure.com. It then figures out our billing profiles, because we need to kind of put this, and like invoice sections, because we need to kind of put this subscription somewhere. And then we choose a invoice section that we're going to create the subscription in, and then this then will go make that. So you can see we were able to successfully create a subscription using the tool, and then this kind of really helps to do all of the correct settings that you're going to need to create that specific evil VM. It's really just making like a generation 1 virtual machine. It's going to make sure that we only have standard security type, not the like more advanced like security type. And you can see here, I just called it like Bastion VM. I think like defenders might think that's just like some important like RDP bot. And then boom, we have now made an evil VM. So there's a bunch of different commands. We can get the list of tenants. We can invite users. That one's really handy in that like if your user doesn't have like a legitimate email address, which like in my lab like it didn't, you get the actual invite URL rather than an email to you. You can just like get it straight out of the command, and so that means that you don't have to have like a legitimate email address like tied to your guest user. So that's really nice. If you're a defender, you can go run a security assessment. As an attacker, you're not going to have privileges to be able to run that, but it's really not very important in that you can just try things and you're going to be able to figure out what the security posture is by just seeing what works and doesn't. And you can see then there's a whole bunch of things for doing things with subscriptions. So Microsoft now have added this to their documentation, which I'm really happy about. I checked yesterday and it was a little bit in better state than it was when I last checked. Before, they just kind of added some stuff about being like an authorized user, which for me felt like it missed the mark of just they were saying that that guests can make subscriptions into your directory, but only authorized guests. But I hope that the one thing that you've got from this talk is that at no point did we authorize the guests to do any of this stuff. Now they're actually saying authorized users, including guest users in your directory, can create subscriptions in another directory where they have billing permissions and then transfer those subscriptions onto your ID directory. And then they tell you, if you don't want this, you should set one or both of the following policies. I would like them to specifically say it's the entering into the Entra ID directory that is the thing, because saying one or both, it's what am I doing? Anyway, hopefully most defenders can figure out from that. So speaking of defense, let's go over that. It's worth understanding. So really, I think the main takeaway for me on this front is prevention is key. If you want to detect this, that's a lot worse than just preventing this behavior from happening altogether. The three key policies that I think are really important for a good defense is that obviously this subscription creation policy. Then there's the guest invite policy. Obviously, if guests can invite guests, or even just regular users can invite guests, then that massively increases in a post-exploitation scenario. If we manage to exploit any low-privileged user, we can then get our billing admin in. So we may want to consider setting it so that only people with a specific invite admin role can invite people into the directory. And then finally, the guest user access level, that's going to determine whether we can do that lookup ID or not. So this is the root cause of what it looks like, the policy of creating the subscriptions in the portal. So you go to subscription policies, and then you can see by default, outrageously, it's set to allow everyone. You're probably going to want to change that to permit to no one. In terms of other controls, if you go to the external collaboration settings, you'll pretty much just want to go through and turn all of these to the most restrictive settings. And then, even though I wouldn't necessarily recommend changing the allowing external users to leave, I think I would still allow users to leave, guest users to leave to aid in cleanup. It is worth just understanding as part of your threat model that that you may see things that from a guest that has just completely disappeared. So probably don't change that one, but just understand it. In terms of other defenses, I think adding MFA for guests via conditional access policies is really important. Just generally monitoring guest-made subscriptions, that's a good idea, but obviously some of these evasion techniques kind of get around that. You want to also take a look at some conditional access policies that are just kind of based on attributes of devices. So you can, for instance, have any device that starts off with Madrid or Vancouver. That's typically aiding in kind of conditional access policies targeting different office locations, and sometimes just the act of having that will influence a conditional access policy, and as an attacker we control the name of these things. Hardened root management group policies, and then also audit devices. So in conclusion, the B2B guest threat model is not well understood. Defaults are insecure, but the good news is hardening works. So I hope you learned something today, and I'm very happy to take questions.